And so now we're starting and essentially finishing, because we only have one lecture class left, module 6. And module 6 is a pretty drastic change of pace from what we've been doing in module 5, which was focusing on, the individual systems that help individuals survive, circulatory, digestive, reproductive, and other systems. Ecology has a small focus on individuals, but specifically it branches out beyond the level of the individual by specifically focusing on how individuals interact with their environment. So specifically, ecology is the study of organisms and their interrelationships with their environment, both biotic and abiotic, which we'll tease apart here in a moment, upon which the distribution and abundance of organisms is determined. So let's kind of break this term down for a second. So first of all, it's the study of organisms and their interrelationship with the environment. So we're no longer focused on the individual level. So up until this point, and through much of 1301 as well, we tend to focus on individual level processes. What, in the study of life, biology, how do organisms live? What are the things that they themselves have that allow them to survive? But with ecology, we're no longer focused just on this individual level. So specifically, these relationships with their environment are going to determine how abundant and how distributed organisms are going to be in a given area. And then lastly, there's this abiotic versus biotic distinction between the different aspects of an organism's environment. So specifically, an organism's environment has both abiotic and biotic components. So what does that mean? So abiotic components are these non-biological factors, things like temperature, light availability, the abundance of water, and different nutrients that are just deposited into the soil, but don't necessarily come from, not nutrients in the form of, a rabbit that this wolf might eat, but rather, the abundance of nitrogen in the soil or other minerals. And then the biotic components, in turn, are those living factors, such as other organisms. And one thing that, we tend to forget, because, now that we've looked at animals in particular, some students have had this tendency to think of biotic components as just, the animal components. But remember, this is including things like plants, bacteria, and other microbes. Those are all biotic. They are living organisms. They just may not be animals, but they all fall under this umbrella term of a biotic factor or a biotic component. When we're talking about ecology, one of the nice reasons we kind of end the semester with ecology is because it kind of closes this loop of where we started this course, which was on, the first module, which was evolution. And ecology and evolutionary biology are very closely linked to one another. They're these closely related sciences. So, one of the reasons for this is because on a timeline, they depend on one another. So events that happen over an ecological time scale, which can sometimes be minutes, days, or years, depending on, the level, the research scale you're using, a term I'll highlight here in a second. This can translate to kind of the ultimate fate of different species, organisms. And so the events that happen at an ecological timescale translate to evolutionary timescales, which can be, decades in the case of, very small, fast-paced living organisms, or millennia for things like most animals, like ourselves. It takes a very long time to see evolutionary change. So for example, hawks that are feeding on mice will impact the mouse population, their ecology, And ultimately, it may lead to selection for mice with fur as camouflage. This is going all the way back to one lecture I gave on natural selection, where hawks were less likely to see mice that blended in with their environment, if you remember that example from a few months ago. But ultimately, how hawks immediately impact the mice's ecology can have evolutionary implications by ultimately seeing the mouse population change over this evolutionary time scale. And so I talked about ecological research scale. And the scale of ecology can vary from microscopic to the entire world. And so we define ecological research scales according to how zoomed in we are on an organism or group of organisms and where they reside. So at the most zoomed in level, we have organismal ecology. And it's just focusing on how an individual interacts with their environment. So, remember that this is different than what we've been studying at this point. For the most part, at this point, we've focused, like in module 5, on what's inside the organism. What, systems have they evolved to help them, digest food or breathe in oxygen, obtain nutrients that they require, or reproduce. With ecology at the organismal level, we're focusing on specifically how individuals interact with environment. So how do they avoid the heat? How do they find water? How do they avoid predators or find prey? And so this is the smallest level of organismal ecology. We zoom out a little bit more and we've got population ecology, where now we're not just focusing on the individual, but a group of individuals of the same species. So this is a vocab term that isn't filled out in the reading guide yet, but this term population means something very specific in biology. And it's specifically the amount of individuals in the same species. So when we talk about our populations, like the population of Houston, we're only counting the number of humans in Houston, right? We're not taking into account dogs and cats. And so, population, think of it that way. Population is the number of individuals within a species, so of the same species. We contrast this with community ecology, where we take it one step further. And now we're talking about individuals across species. So, the population of Houston might be, 4 million or so, something around there is the last I remember. But the community of Houston, from a biological perspective, would be orders of magnitude larger, because we're talking now about all interacting species within a given area. So I'm not talking about just our dogs and cats, but when I say all interacting species, it's all animals, all bacteria within the Houston area, all plants, all trees, shrubs, individual grass organisms. All of those would make up the entire, Houston community. And so, that's the next level, where we're looking at all species, so all living things. We can take it one step further beyond that, refer to Houston as the ecosystem. So now it's not just the living things, not the organisms, but all the abiotic factors that compose Houston as well. Our highways and infrastructure, the soil, from a biological perspective, the soil environment Houston finds itself in, as well as the polluted air we live in. And then lastly, we can look beyond Houston. We may refer to Houston as the ecosystem, but then ultimately you zoom out all the way to the global scale, which is the biosphere. This is the study of the global ecosystem. And this is where you take into account Earth air movement patterns, things like general global climate. So when you hear about climate research, this is an area of biosphere scale ecology. And so, this is just showing this another way that, just like I gave the example of zooming out, you can also zoom in on the world. So starting at the world at the biggest scale, you go beyond that, and then you're talking about astrophysics and astronomy. But, for biology, our biggest scale that we're concerned with is the Earth. Maybe that'll change in the future once the aliens arrive, but for now, we kind of focus on the Earth. But you can zoom into the ecosystem level, and then a community by just focusing on the living things in that area. The population, where maybe you just want to know about one species in particular, or the organism. How does the average, in this case, I don't know, prairie dog interact with its environment? And so just, this is just reiterating these points where, the global scale is concerned with the biosphere. And sometimes the ecosystem and global scale are kind of hard to tease apart because, the ecosystem is already talking about all living things and non-living, the abiotic things as well. And so one way to kind of distinguish between the global and ecosystem level scale is in the types of questions that are being asked. So from a global perspective, often this is referring to global patterns and the sum of all ecosystems. So taking into account, when you do studies that range from the equator to the poles, this is getting at that global scale, whereas the ecosystem scale is focusing most often on one or just a few small connected ecosystems. Again, community ecology now zooms in on just living things, but it's all living things. Population ecology focuses on just one particular group of things, one species, the kind of the just members of the same species. And then organismal is zoomed into the max, where it's just one individual interacting with their environment. And so, when we're talking about ecosystems, kind of the largest unit of an ecosystem, what comprises the whole global scale of all ecosystems, are biomes. So biomes are these large kind of distinctive complex of communities that are created and maintained by the climate. So these biomes are essentially determined by these global scale patterns. And we'll see what those what those two biggest global influencers are on the development of these different biomes. But this is where you start to see terms like desert, savannas. Then there are some that are less familiar, like coniferous forest. But you should know what a coniferous forest is by now, because in module 4 we talked about conifers, right? So and then tundras, the Arctic deserts of the world. And so based on the different global patterns, wind patterns, precipitation, light availability, biomes kind of distribute themselves in predictable manners. And so the two global predictors I'll focus on for this supplemental lecture are latitude, which is going to affect sunlight availability, and then wind patterns. So for latitude, we often don't think of what really the effect of the sun is on the Earth. We just note general patterns, though. In the equator it's hot, up in the north and in the very south it's very cold. And the reason for that actually has to do with the shape of a planet in general. So due to latitudinal variation, so latitude referring to the horizontal lines of the Earth, as you go further and further away from the equator, we're actually affecting the intensity of sunlight that the Earth is receiving. So the sunlight kind of hits the Earth dead on, but it hits some areas of the Earth more directly than others. And so specifically in the tropics, sunlight hits the Earth directly. As we actually get to lower and lower latitudes, higher and higher latitudes, so closer to the poles, then the angle of the incoming light actually forms what's called an oblique angle. The angle is smaller the way it hits the Earth. And so because of this, light is actually more diffuse. It's not hitting this part of the Earth as directly as it does in the equator. And so this does something that affects precipitation levels based on wind patterns as well across the world. So first of all, air circulation patterns and precipitation patterns can be directly linked to this intensity of sunlight. So it hits most intensely near the equator. And what this does, just as you might expect when you stick a magnifying glass to try and burn a leaf, or if you're sadistic, an ant, what this does is it causes the warmest, wettest air on Earth to rise up. It's heating up the water in a way that causes it to create vapor. This wet air rises up, and then it starts to travel away from the equator, northbound in our scenario, or to our friends south of the border or south of the equator, it moves southward. And so this warm, wet air, as it moves higher and higher up, it's releasing a lot of that moisture that's in the air. And so this is why the Earth tends to look a lot greener closer to the equator. But as you move further and further north, that air gets drier and drier. And this is actually where the majority of the deserts of the world are. We see it most often in the northern hemisphere, talking about the Sahara Desert, as well as the Mojave and other deserts on our continent. But, although there's less land in general towards the south of the Earth, places like Australia and Chile and Argentina are vast deserts as well. And so a result of that is, directly related to how the sun is hitting the Earth. It hits the equator most directly, which causes vapor to rise up with the air. And then as it dries, it kind of drops back down, and it actually absorbs, since the air is now so dry, it's absorbing moisture. This leaches off all the water in the land in these areas, and it creates these desert environments. So it's all about how the sun hits the Earth and where that, whether that air is moist or dry. And then actually it creates, this other pattern. As the air drops back down, it does again pick up moisture, and this is why other regions like the northern US and a lot of Europe is a lot more fertile as well, because there's another line between the equator and the North and South poles that are much more humid. And it's because this dry air kind of reaches a point where it can't float anymore, it drops down, and it has an opportunity to pick up moisture again. And so ultimately, the variation in the speed of the Earth's rotation at different latitudes results in these big wind patterns. And so you've probably heard, but maybe don't have a good concept of what these actually are, but the trade winds refer to these tropic winds that blow from east to west. So these southeast trades and northeast trades are referred to as the trade winds. And then you have the westerly winds. And in these regions of the world, the wind actually blows the opposite way, from west to east in temperate environments. And so ultimately, as a result of the sunlight and wind patterns, these create different climates depending on the area of the world you're in. And so the world can shape climate, but also local factors as well. So specifically, whether or not you're near a mountain range or a large body of water is also going to affect your climate, because this is going to affect the immediate kind of cloud presence, which with clouds come rain, that you're experiencing. So mountains are going to force moist air to go up, moving across them. And then as that air cools, the water falls as rain. And so the result is that most often on one side of a mountain range, there's a lot of wet, fertile land. And then typically on the other side, it's very dry. So, in terms of the US, you can imagine this as California. This is the Pacific Ocean. Usually kind of sandwiched between the biggest mountain range, the Sierra Nevadas, and the ocean is going to be a lot of fertile land. But then as you move just past that, you get into dry desert, because the clouds essentially kind of get blocked between the ocean and the mountain. So as they get blocked, the rain falls, And then any clouds that pass after that are completely dry at this point. And clouds are essentially non-present since clouds are moisture. But as I mentioned before, as well as these kind of local patterns influencing climate, there are global patterns as well. And so this kind of ultimately affects, the sort of terrestrial biome, which we'll dig into more deeply with, I think, the first activity that we'll go over tomorrow. But biomes are essentially the major types of ecosystem that cover these large areas of the earth. So we're talking about, we're not, an ecosystem may only be miles long. Biomes are huge chunks of the world that can be broken up into one of these few kind of types of biomes. This isn't all of the biomes, but this covers a good portion of the biomes you see on Earth. And so as a species, focusing back on like the living aspect of ecology, individuals and species in general are going to distribute themselves according to the biome that they're best adapted to. And so the way they kind of clump together or distribute themselves within a biome is going to be dependent, again, looking back at that definition of ecology, on both biotic and abiotic factors. So when we think of what affects how species distribute themselves in a given area, we can break it down by its biotic and abiotic components. Now, there are a lot of different biotic and abiotic factors that affect species distributions. This is just a very small laundry list of factors of each kind. And to kind of demonstrate how all species distribute themselves according to both biotic and abiotic factors, I'm going to use the example of the Pokemon Heatmor. So this is a Heatmor. Just like any other living thing on this earth, Heatmors require certain specific environmental conditions, both biotic and abiotic, in order to survive and thrive as a species. So specifically, as the name and maybe the look might suggest, Heatmors require warm environments, temperature. In Pokemon, Heatmors are fire-type Pokemon, and fire-type Pokemon like Heatmor are also weak to rock and ground environments. So they typically avoid these rocky, heavy soil environments because it's just not what they're adapted to. Fire requires oxygen, and the more oxygen there is, the more powerful its flame attacks can be. So it needs high oxygen environment and should specifically avoid water, which will kind of negate all of its fire-based strengths, right? And it needs its fire-based strengths to capture its primary source of nutrition, their primary food source, a biotic factor in the form of these durants. Wherever there are more durants, Heatmors will want to be more abundant. Wherever there's more food, that's where you go to. But the durants, in turn, will select where they colonize based on the vegetation they use for their own nutrition. They're herbivores, and so wherever there's more plants that they can digest, they're going to abound there. And so we can see that the distribution and density of Heatmors is going to be strongly connected to the abundance of their prey, durants, as well as the durants' needs. And so these predator-prey interactions most often determine where you're going to find both species. So as you might imagine, they also keep each other in check. Heatmors eat durants, and so since they're one of the major factors responsible for the death of durants, this causes durant populations to go down. But then ultimately this is going to cause Heatmor populations to go down as well because there's not enough durants around. Once the Heatmor population dwindles, though, the durant population can kind of ramp back up. And then again, this increased food resource makes the Heatmor population go up as a result. Again, predators and prey often keep each other in check. But we have to remember about the abiotic factors as well. And so ultimately, the density and distribution of almost every population, so remember, a group of individuals within one species, the Heatmor in this case, is going to depend on how both biotic and abiotic resources are distributed in an environment. And so if the Heatmor depend on their durant, and the durant depend on vegetation, and ultimately the vegetation depends on things like soil and nutrient availability within the soil and water abundance, then you can ultimately get distribution patterns of species mimic the availability of those resources. And we have specific terminology and vocabulary depending on these distribution patterns that the species represents. And yes, this is more vocabulary, but these vocab terms are really easy and logical if you just think of the word itself. Basically, these are vocab terms that are just like how they sound: uniform, clumped, and random. So in a clumped distribution, you're going to see heat mores more abundant in some areas and less abundant in others. Ultimately, almost everything has a clumped distribution at the most zoomed out level, right? There are places that humans can't live and other places where we abound, big cities versus very small rural or desolate places. But as you zoom in within certain areas, you can see different patterns, like uniform distributions where we kind of just space out evenly, or random distributions where there is no known rhyme or reason as to how species distribute themselves in an environment. These are going to be species that don't rely on as many biotic or abiotic levels. But it's important to kind of note that these uniform and random distributions most typically are kind of seen at a zoomed in level. Ultimately, there's no species that can tolerate every single environment just as well as any other biome. So ultimately, we all have clumped distributions, but as you zoom in, you can start to see patterns of uniformity or randomness or greater clumped distributions. And so I'll leave this lecture here, and hopefully you find it useful, not just for the prep quiz, but in preparation for the exam in a couple weeks. And yeah, I will see y'all tomorrow.